Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Judy Markowitz, and I'm a librarian here at McKeldin, and I'm the librarian liaison to the School of Public Policy, the Departments of Women's Studies, Government and Politics, and LGBT Studies. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our Speaking of Books series. This series was started by the libraries in 2005 to showcase some of the excellent research being published by faculty right here on campus. And today we will hear a presentation from Dr. Sahar Khamis, and she will discuss her latest book, Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions, and this is a book she co-edited with Emil Milley. Okay. And before my formal introduction, and she starts, I wanted to let you know that we have several other book talks coming up, and you can always go to the library's homepage and search for Speaking of Books to get additional details. But Thursday, April 19th from 4:30 to 6 in the Michelle Smith Collaboratory for Visual Culture, which is in the Art Sociology building. Stephen Mansbach from the Department of Art History and Archaeology will talk about his book, Advancing a Different Modernism. On Thursday, April 26th from 4 to 5:30, Robert Childs from the Department of History will talk about his book, The Revolution of 28, Al Smith, American Progressivism and the Coming of the New Deal, and that's here in the special events room. And Thursday, May 10th, 3 to 5 in the piano room at the Michelle Smith Performing Arts Library. There's a conversation with Hugo Kiesing. He's a former professor in the Department of American Studies, and his talk is titled Battleground Korea, Songs and Sounds of America's Forgotten War. So there's something for everyone there. Again, you can visit our library's homepage and get the details. So a little bit about our speaker today. She is an associate professor in the Department of Communication, as well as an affiliated faculty in Women's Studies and Public Health. She is an expert on Arab and Muslim media and the former head of the Mass Communication and Information Science Department in Qatar University. She is a former Mellon Islamic Studies Initiative visiting professor at the University of Chicago. She is the co-author of the books Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, Palgrave Macmillan 2009, and Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, also Palgrave Macmillan 2013. Additionally, she has authored and co-authored numerous book chapters, journal articles, and conference papers, regionally and internationally, in both English and Arabic. She is a recipient of a number of prestigious academic and professional awards, as well as a member of the editorial boards of several journals in the field of communication in general, and the field of Arab and Muslim media in particular. She is a media commentator and analyst, a public speaker, a human rights commissioner in the Human Rights Commission in Montgomery County, Maryland, and a radio host who presents a monthly radio show on U.S. Arab Radio, the first Arab American radio station broadcasting in the U.S. and Canada. So please join me in welcoming Professor Khamis.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to listen to my book talk. I really appreciate it. And thanks a lot to Judy for this very kind introduction and also for her efforts in making this event actually happen. And thanks to the University of Maryland Library and all the organizers of the Speaking of Books series for making this event possible for all of us this afternoon. So my book talk this afternoon about my new co-edited book, which is Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions. And this is what the book looks like virtually, and this is what it looks like physically. And of course, as we all know, everything now is becoming digitally based and electronically based, so it wouldn't be very hard for you to find the book available online as an ebook, as well as through Amazon and Palgrave Macmillan, if my talk inspires you, which I hope is the case, to actually look into the book and read it for yourselves and get to familiarize yourself with the scholarship in it. So let's talk a little bit about this book, and I must admit this is my first time attempting to edit a book volume, and it's a huge undertaking. I don't know how many of my colleagues here in the room have actually gone through this process of editing or co-editing a book volume, but it's a huge undertaking. My first 2 books, as Judy kindly mentioned, were co-authored. That's easier. Authored is easier than edited because you have to really not worry about how your own words are being expressed, but also how your colleagues' ideas are being presented, and you have to go through the whole process and the revisions. It's a big undertaking. So the book itself is co-edited by myself. I'm an Egyptian American scholar. I've been here with the University of Maryland Department of Communication for the last 11 years. I can't believe I'm saying that. It feels like yesterday. And I've been tenured here with the Department of Communication back in 2014. My co-editor is a Tunisian American scholar, Professor Amal Mili. When we were writing the book together and editing it, she was actually the director of the Arabic Language and Culture program at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. And now she is with the Global Studies Department at Drexel University. The book also includes contributions by a number of experts on gender-related matters and issues representing different academic backgrounds, as well as different nationalities. So some of the authors are from within the Arab region, some of them are from outside the Arab region, some of them are actually from Arab Spring countries, the countries that witnessed the Arab Spring uprisings, and some of them are from non-Arab Spring countries. And we also have both genders. So although most of the chapters are actually written by women, we don't believe in the idea of excluding men from discussing women's issues. I don't think it's a good idea to exclude men just because they're men, because men are also gendered beings, and some of them can have something useful to share and to say about women and women's activism, and therefore we should invite them to the table. So one of the authors in the book is Professor Brahim Ghwabli. He's doing his PhD at Princeton University, and he's a Moroccan American. So the book consists of 12 chapters written by 11 authors. Beside the 2 editors, myself and Professor Amal Mili, we also have Nada Al-Wadi, an activist and journalist from Bahrain. She co-authored a chapter with me in the book. Rita Stefan, a Lebanese-American scholar. Deborah Harold from the US, also from UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, and currently visiting with Drexel. Asma Nouera from Tunisia. Nahid Al-Tantawi, an Egyptian-American scholar. Naomi Tuzjnami from Japan. Sana Jelasi from Jordan, Lubna Frolish Azam, an Irish-German, and Brahim El-Ghwabli, a Moroccan-American. So we did really make an effort to try to have different voices in this volume, and not to have it, as we said, all women, or not to have it all Arab scholars or all from within Arab Spring countries, for the purpose of diversity and for the purpose of inclusion. The book was endorsed kindly and generously by Professor Hamid Dabbashi of Columbia University, Professor Dina Matar at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, Professor Noha Miller from University of Bedfordshire in England, and Professor Valerie Orlando, our own colleague here at the University of Maryland School of Languages, Literature, and Culture. So, why this book, right? Why study Arab women's activism? Why should we actually, concern ourselves with this particular topic and indulge ourselves in trying to understand it better? We're trying here to deconstruct some of the myth and the false stereotypes about Arab women who have been historically depicted as powerless, marginalized, weak, or highly sexualized erotic beings, or all of the above, right? So there are ample misrepresentations and ample stereotypes about women in general, and Arab and Muslim women in particular, and this book is an effort to try to deconstruct some of these myths and some of these misperceptions and stereotypes. We are trying to reveal many of the phases and faces, I like this one, phases and faces of Arab women's multiple activisms and resistances, which have been intertwined with the lived realities of these women politically and socially in their own respective countries. And also illustrating how these activisms and resistances cross-cut the political, social, and legal spheres simultaneously. So basically, it's an effort to try to paint a more rich, deep, diverse, holistic picture of these women's multiple lived realities, politically, socially, and legally, which is something we don't always see or hear about frequently or accurately. And you will notice here the plural S, right? Activisms, right? Resistances, and that is done actually on purpose. This plural S is on purpose to say, hey, wait a minute. We do not have one single monolithic uniform form of activism or a uniform singular form of resistance. These are varied phenomena, they're pluralistic, and there are so many different forms, and we have to take that into account and into consideration. Also illustrating how these activisms and resistances extended before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprisings, and in both Arab Spring and non-Arab Spring countries, although in different forms, degrees, intensities, and through varied modes of expression. Some people, when they talk about Arab women, they go, yeah, I've seen all of these pictures from Tahrir Square and the women, and oh yeah, they're so vocal and active. I'm like, yeah, indeed, that was a very important moment, but guess what? It is not the only moment, and it's not the only example or type of activism that these women have been engaging in, because in fact, they have been engaging in multiple forms of activisms and resistances before, during, and after the so-called Arab Spring movements and uprisings. Shedding light on some of the most important opportunities, threats, and uncertainties facing Arab women's movements today. So what has been accomplished? What have been the achievements that we should be proud of? What are some of the threats and challenges facing these women? And there are so many of them. And what are the uncertainties ahead that we also have to keep an eye on? And deconstructing the notion of a uniform, standard, and fixed form of feminism, which is oftentimes defined within a narrow, ethnocentric Western perspective, which gives birth to what we can call Save the Muslim Woman syndrome. Right? So I'll talk about this in a moment because it's one of my favorite topics, and my students in honors humanities are smiling because we talk about that in class, right? The idea that there is no singular way of saying, my way of life is the only valid, legitimate way for anyone else who wants to develop. So if you want to develop, you better follow my footsteps. You better just follow my example, right? There is no such thing, because every culture, every country, every society, every group of people have their own individual, unique culture, needs, wants, characteristics that define them. And we have to respect these and take them into account. So we cannot even define just a uniform, monolithic form of feminism and say, okay, so all the women have to act, dress, behave this way if they have any hope of being independent or powerful or liberated. So we're trying to challenge this notion and to show the diversity and the plurality here. So really through the book you can see that there have been three layers of what we can call three layers of invisibility and marginalization. Women in general, and Arab and Muslim women in particular, have historically suffered from three layers of invisibility and marginalization. First, invisibility in the socio-economic domain because of their undocumented informal labor. So there's another syndrome here which is called, I am not working, I am just a housewife. When I was doing my own PhD dissertation research at the University of Manchester in England, I conducted my field work in one of the Egyptian villages in Egypt, in the Delta region in Egypt. And I'd go and ask a woman, can you please tell me what are you doing? And she would say, I'm not working, I am just a housewife. And then I say, can you please describe your day? What time do you get up? Oh, I wake up at 5:30 in the morning. And then what do you do? Oh, I work, I help my husband in the field, I cook, I clean, I prepare the dinner. When the kids come back home, I take care of them. What time do you go to bed? Usually around 9:30 p.m. and by that time I'm dead tired. If you count how many hours this woman is working, it can mount up to 12, 13 hours of work, hard work, right? Inside and outside the home. But if you ask her the question, she will say, I'm not working, I'm just a housewife. Why is this the case? Because we are just valuing what we call the formal, documented employment. I get a paycheck every couple of weeks, that means I'm working. Well, she's working too, but her work is undocumented and informal, and that's a form of invisibility in the socio-economic sphere. The second form of invisibility is invisibility in academic literature, which either underrepresented or obscured the complex lived realities of women. So this book is an attempt to hopefully contribute to countering some of these layers of marginalization and defying this invisibility in academic literature. Just recently, there have been departments of women's studies. I'm proudly an affiliate faculty of women's studies here on this campus. Gender studies, LGBTQ studies, all of that is relatively new. But for a long time, many of these identities have not been really dealt with sufficiently in academic literature and academic writing. The third layer of invisibility and marginalization is invisibility in the media, through either excluding women completely, just exclusion, they're not there, they're not talked about, their issues are not tackled, or through underrepresentation of women's voices, images, identities, and realities, or through stereotypical, false, and skewed misrepresentations, which either depict them as oppressed, helpless beings, or as highly sexualized objects, right? You see all of these ads and commercials and soap operas and dramas. I was telling one of my students today, the beautiful car with a beautiful woman next to it, and you don't understand the connection between the car and the woman, or even a car, or even a refrigerator and a beautiful woman, or an oven and a beautiful woman, and you go like, is there any connection between what is shown here and the beautiful woman next to it? Well, because some people think that this is just pleasing for the eyes of the consumers, and therefore using women as objects just for the male gaze, just to please the viewers and the consumers, and hopefully to encourage them to go out and buy these commodities, right? So again, this is something we need to be aware of and hopefully work to try to overcome and to deconstruct as well. So the book really looks at parallel struggles, three main parallel struggles. We can argue that Arab women have been engaging in three parallel struggles simultaneously. The first one is the political struggle to free their countries from the forces of dictatorship, autocracy, and authoritarianism. And in engaging in this type of struggle, Arab women across different ideological orientations and demographic categories have been actively engaging in resistance movements over many decades. So again, I emphasize the word over many decades, because again, it was not just born with the Arab Spring uprisings. These political resistance movements extended before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprisings and took different forms and various degrees of intensity. One good example was Egyptian women's active involvement in a group known as No Military Trials for Civilians, which was created in Egypt when SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in Egypt, took over during the transitional period following the deposing of President Hosni Mubarak from office and until President Morsi was elected to office. During that period of time, there was a group formed. Women were very, very active in leading, not just joining, but leading the group and saying, we are gonna work to make sure that no civilian has to face an unfair and unjust military trial. During this period, Egyptian women, such as Mona Saif and the lawyer Rajia Umran, assumed positions of leadership in this group, setting very bright examples of women's bravery and heroism and courage. So imagine women going out and, really every time you go out in the street and you resist, you are putting yourself at risk. This is not a joke. Many women have been harassed, killed, imprisoned, arrested, lost their jobs. There is a very high price that women pay because of their engagement in such movements. And guess what? There is always this negative syndrome or phenomena whereby women are encouraged to join and to participate in the struggle, and they pay the full price. Once this is over, they're told, thank you so much, ladies. It's time for you now to go back to the kitchen. Literally. Like, wait a minute, I was just there in this particular demonstration facing the risk of dying, of being killed, of being arrested, of being harassed, you name it, and then suddenly, thank you, just go back to the kitchen. Literally in Egypt, after the 2011 revolution and the deposing of Mubarak, people were so hopeful. We had so very high, I'm originally from Egypt myself, a lot of high hopes and expectations. And women said, that's it, that's a good moment. Let's capture this moment. Let's try to organize a 1 million women march in the heart of Tahrir Square and to call for women's rights. Guess what? Only 500 women showed up and they were yelled at with negative comments and negative words, and they were told, we don't have time for that now. We are trying to build a country. We have more important issues to take care of. Women's issues can come later. You ladies can just go to the hair salon, do your nails, whatever. You don't need to worry about that now. And this is a very big problem. I think that women have to learn the lesson that if you are really putting yourself at risk and participating fully and effectively, you cannot just accept this, go back to the kitchen, go to the hair salon kind of attitude. Because women's issues are indeed part and parcel of society's issues. They're not separate or divorced from the political, economic, and social realities in their respective countries. So building the country without paying attention to women's issues and women's rights is just not right. Another type of struggle is the social struggle. This is just having its own mind here. Okay. So the reversals in freedom and democratization had negative implications on civic movements in general and women's involvement within these movements in particular. In other words, whenever you have a reversal in democratization or in reform or freedom in any country, this is also likely to affect civic engagement and civic movements in general, and women's involvement in these movements in particular in pretty harsh and pretty difficult and negative ways. Of course, the stifling of freedoms. If you have less freedom, you have less democratization. People are not encouraged to go out and speak. They're not encouraged to go out and represent or present their points of view or express their ideas. In fact, they can face very high prices for that. That means a backlash. It means a reduction or a decrease in the amount of civic involvement and engagement, and it means that less women are also going to be able to participate in these movements safely and effectively, and that has been the case in many of the countries that were tackled in this book. The second type of struggle is the social struggle, and the social struggle is meant to resist different forms of discrimination, prejudice, and bias against women, as well as overcoming some of the negative, harmful practices against them, such as sexual harassment, for example, right? So yes, political resistance and political activism is important. It's just one type of activism for women. The second type of struggle is the social struggle, because women, on top of the political struggle to topple dictators and autocratic regimes, they also have to fight other parallel fights as well, such as fighting misogyny and patriarchy and stagnant traditions and negative practices such as domestic violence, sexual harassment, and all of them. One good example the book talks about, Nahid al-Tantawi, the Egyptian-American scholar, in her chapter talks about sexual harassment campaigns in Egypt. So she talks about a campaign called Shuft Taharrush, which means I saw harassment, and an application called Harass Map. These are very interesting examples of how new technology and social media and new media are being used and deployed in order to try to bring attention to issues of importance and significance for women. In this case, issues such as sexual harassment. And it illustrates a spillover from the realm of citizen journalism to the realm of mainstream media in an effort to influence public opinion on these issues. Let me explain this point. So for a long time, the mainstream media in many of these countries, I'm saying here Arab countries, have been controlled by authoritarian, autocratic regimes. Of course, the margin of freedom can shrink and stretch depending on which country we are talking about, and also which phase or which era are we talking about. Naturally, we cannot put everybody in the same basket and make sweeping, inaccurate, overgeneralizations. But there have been certain taboos, both politically and socially. You don't criticize the president or his family. You don't talk about things like, God forbid, corruption. You don't talk about things like, God forbid, violations of human rights. And you don't talk about, God forbid, things like sexual harassment, because you're not supposed to, right? These are taboo issues. So what happened here is that a lot of activists, including prominent women activists, started to break these taboos. And they started to break the taboos on all spheres and all levels, politically as well as socially, right? So politically, by joining the movement to try to expose, corrupt regimes, corrupt dictators, corrupt practices in government, as well as also wrong social practices like domestic violence, like sexual harassment. And this particular campaign, شفت تحرش, I saw harassment, and Harass Map, which is basically an app that shows you areas where there have been incidents of sexual harassment. So it will give you like certain places on the map that would be like, if it's a red zone, that means it has a very high number of incidents where sexual harassment cases or incidents have taken place. And these were created by women as well as men allies, men who are also feminists, who believe in women's rights, who believe that no woman should ever face sexual harassment. They joined the effort to also create the campaign and to create the app, going back to our earlier point about not excluding men in the struggle for women's rights. This is one example here. Nawara Negm is a prominent Egyptian blogger who actually used her blog for both social as well as political activism. So she had hundreds of thousands of followers on her Twitter account, and on her blog she had a lot of people, also hundreds of thousands on her blog. And she did not just talk about the corruption of the Mubarak regime or about fighting dictatorship and autocracy. She also talked very boldly about issues like sexual harassment. And by doing so, she and others helped to create the spillover from the realm of citizen journalism and online activism to the realm of mainstream media. So basically now the national paper cannot just turn a blind eye to the fact that there's an epidemic sexual harassment on the streets of Cairo, unfortunately. They cannot just turn a blind eye to it and act that it's not there, because it's there, and because these bloggers are so bold and brave to break the taboo, both politically and socially, and to talk about all of these issues, right? It has a life of its own and a mind of its own, just switching. So Nawara Negm and others, when they started to talk about all of these issues and to bring all of these concerns to the surface, right? Things like sexual harassment and all of that stuff, now the mainstream media are obliged, they actually have to break the taboo and to talk about all of these issues as well. And that's why we're saying breaking the taboo both politically and socially. The third struggle is the legal struggle. And that's a very important point, because oftentimes it's a blind hole. Not very many people talk about it or write about it, despite the fact that it's a very, very important aspect. Laws and legislations make a huge difference. And when women themselves are able to draft these laws, that also makes a huge difference. My co-editor, Professor Amal Mili, beside being an academic, she was also previously a judge in Tunisia. And Tunisia, as we're going to talk about it in a moment, is a country that does really set a good positive example and good model in terms of women's activism and empowerment. And in my opinion, one of the important forms of empowerment has been having women draft laws and take part in the legislative process of coming up with new laws and legislations. So the legal struggle is very important to pass new laws and legislations which can be useful and beneficial for women, or to change some of the existing laws which are discriminating against women. So basically trying to either come up with new laws or to change some of the bad ones that already exist. One good example is the passing of the new groundbreaking law against domestic violence in Tunisia, which was hailed by many for its comprehensiveness, gender equity and inclusion, since it prohibited all forms of violence against women, whether physically, sexually, socially, economically, or politically. So that's really a very, very important law to talk about, because in the past, people used to look at violence against women as quote-unquote a private issue. Oh, her husband slapped her. Society should not really be involved in this. It's a private domestic issue. No, it's not. It's part of human rights, and we should all be concerned about it, because nobody should be beaten or harassed or abused, period. So this new law became very groundbreaking. Tunisia, I think, is number 19 in the whole world to adopt this law in this comprehensive fashion that actually redefined the issue of violence to make it much more inclusive, taking it out of the private sphere into the public sphere. It's not just a private matter, it is now a public matter that we all have to be concerned about. And therefore defining violence as physical violence, sexual violence, social violence, economic violence, and political violence. So if a woman is not allowed to run for office just because she's a woman, that's a form of violence and discrimination against her. If she's not allowed to get a job or to get equal pay just because she's a woman, that's a form of discrimination and violence against her. So that's a groundbreaking law, and guess what? Tunisian women have been actively involved in drafting this new law, which I think makes all the difference. So by doing so, this law took the issue of violence against women out of the private domestic sphere into the public sphere. It also raised the age of marriage for women and prohibited all forms of gender-based discrimination, and it eliminated a law which was called the law of shame, which enabled the rapist to escape punishment through marrying his victim. And this was emulated in other Arab countries such as Lebanon and Jordan afterwards. So again, going back to the issue of not just drafting new laws, but changing bad laws that already exist. So in this case, raising the age of marriage, eliminating the law of shame. How can you allow a rapist to escape punishment? By allowing him to marry the person he raped. You're punishing her twice. One time by being raped and one time by marrying her rapist. And that's why it became known as the law of shame. And when Tunisia abolished it, other countries were also encouraged to do the same, like Lebanon and Jordan. They also eliminated this law of shame, and I hope that it does not exist anywhere else as well, because it's a horrible law in the first place. So again, women being, when you are at the table, you will not be on the menu, right? Although there has been, generally speaking, a positive correlation between the degree of political freedom allowed in a certain country and the progress made in terms of women's rights, whether politically, socially, or legally. One interesting paradox and anomaly was found in the case of Bahrain. The crackdown on political opposition in Bahrain by the regime in power resulted in getting rid of many of the conservative Shiite religious clerics and scholars who were opposed to passing the new family law in Bahrain, which gave women some rights, such as granting Bahraini citizenship to their children if they married foreigners. So generally speaking, the chapters in the book or the studies here show that there has been a positive correlation between when you have more freedom, you have more empowerment for women, and vice versa, like we said before. In the case of Bahrain, and that's the chapter I co-authored with Nada Al-Wadi, the Bahraini journalist and activist, we have seen an interesting anomaly and paradox, because in this particular case, when there was a governmental crackdown and oppression, some of the very conservative Shiite religious scholars and clerics were actually put in jail, and by so doing, actually they gave a platform for some new laws and regulations that were pro-women and pro-women's rights to pass, such as the right of the Bahraini women to pass on their citizenship to their children if they married non-Bahraini. So that's a paradox and an anomaly. The three phases of feminism that the book also talks about, the first phase was known as nationalism and fighting colonialism. And in this particular phase, the struggle for women's liberation and independence was intertwined with the struggle to liberate their own countries from foreign powers. And the leaders of this very early stage of feminism were mostly urban, middle-class, elitist, and Western-educated men, like Qasim Amin in Egypt, Tahir Haddad in Tunisia. And they were later on joined by mostly elitist, upper middle class, Western educated or Western influenced women, such as Huda Sha'rawi in Egypt and Nazira Zainuddin in Lebanon. So here, the very early phase was like basically, you're trying to resist colonialism, you're trying to seek independence for your country, and also trying to seek things like women's education. Some scholars I met and talked to, they wouldn't even consider this quote-unquote feminism because it did not really emanate from women themselves. It emanated from some elitist male leaders, and then were joined by elitist upper middle class or upper class women who did not necessarily always represent the majority of women or trickle down sufficiently to the grassroots level, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And the second phase was the post-colonial stage of modern nation building. In this stage, most of the vision for women's independence and liberation was mostly shaped by the new leaders of these newly independent countries, whether it was Nasser in Egypt with his socialist agenda, or Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, for example, with his secular, Western-oriented agenda, which remains to be highly controversial, drawing both praise and criticism at once. So you will see some of the voices in the book like really praising Habib Bourguiba as a great, liberator for women, and he brought about a lot of gains, and there's no question that the level of education in Tunisia is much higher in general and among women in particular than in other Arab countries. Women acting as judges, including my co-editor, like I mentioned before. All of that is great and awesome, but of course there will be other voices that will say he went a bit too far, he allowed abortion without any kind of restriction, he was for quote unquote a Western defined notion of feminism that may not necessarily always fit or kind of really be part and parcel of the overall culture in many of the countries in the region. So there is some controversy around him, but definitely he should be given credit for some of the gains that he achieved for women in Tunisia. This stage also brought about what we can call the First Lady syndrome, whereby First Ladies such as Jihan Sadat and later on Suzanne Mubarak in Egypt, for example, championed the tide of gender-related reform and dictated the agenda for it. So again, here you are seeing in this phase some kind of top-down, somehow elitist, upper class form of elitist, feminism that is not necessarily emanating from the grassroots or from women at every stage and every level of society. And again, that drew some kind of criticism that yes, it can bring about some gains for women, but at the same time, is it really totally, completely representative of all women? That's a different story altogether. Therefore, it could be said that these two early phases of Arab women's feminism, despite the multiple gains that they brought in terms of increasing the salience and recognition and visibility of women's issues and women's rights, were also mostly characterized by being top-down elitist movements, which did not always trickle down sufficiently to wider circles or segments of women in different Arab countries. It wasn't until the third phase of Arab women's feminism, which accompanied the Arab Spring movements, that we really started to witness the trickle-down effect and the emergence of what we can call bottom-up grassroots activism. In other words, not coming from the First Lady, not coming from the leader, not coming from whoever is at the top of the hierarchy, but rather coming from the base, from the grassroots, from women themselves. So what were the characteristics of this third phase of Arab Spring movements? They were mostly characterized by grassroots popular movements, peaceful protest across the board, semi-leaderless because they had some leadership, but it was pretty much across the board and diffused. Significant role played by youth, significant role played by women. Social media acted as catalysts to speed up and to amplify the voices of change and reform, and different outcomes unfolded in different countries, both politically and socially. So for those of you who are familiar with these movements, these were some of the most important characteristics of these movements, and I think the fact that they were across the board and they were pretty much inclusive. They were not just about Islamists or secular or men or women or young or old. They were pretty much representative of everybody and inclusive of everyone. And that, I think, was a golden moment. I mean, I would love to see us go back to this fantastic moment in 2011 when we saw this historical, iconic, ideal solidarity and unity where everybody had the same goal and the same aim, which of course was wonderful. And women played a very important role as well in the midst of these movements. Women played a visible role in the Arab Spring movements, and many took part in what we can describe as non-stereotypical gender roles. In other words, they were not just nursing or nurturing or supporting men. Rather, they were in the front lines of resistance, risking their own lives and facing the risk of injury, arrest, harassment, or even death. Like we said before, very iconic, historical, brave, and courageous roles in the front lines of resistance. The selection of Tawakkul Karman, the Yemeni activist and journalist who came to be known as the mother of the revolution in Yemen, as the first Arab woman to ever receive the Nobel Prize, signified international recognition and appreciation for Arab women's roles in these movements, and for the role, of course, that they played in terms of bravery and courage in particular. And there were so many other role models as well in the midst of these movements. And as I'm going to say later, they were not just role models for other women, they were role models for everybody, including men. So even men looked up at them and said, wow, this is such a brave woman. I wish I can have her courage and her bravery. One of the women who became famous in this particular phase was Asma Mahfouz, this young 25-year-old activist. She posted a vlog. We all know the terminology used by young people nowadays. So when you blog using video, they call this a vlog. So she posted this vlog about the revolution, January 25th, 2011 revolution, speaking very boldly and very openly against the regime and asking people to go out and to protest and to take a position against the Mubarak regime. And she therefore was called the most brave girl in Egypt at the time for her level of activism. And here you see this woman is a very average, middle-class Egyptian woman that you can meet anywhere in the streets of Cairo. She's very average, and she's holding this sign asking for the release of one of the activists from prison. He has been detained. He's another victim of the emergency law, which just gives a free hand to government to go and arrest anyone if they think they look suspicious, without any kind of due course, legal process, trial, you name it. So basically, this woman is saying, free this activist from jail, let him go, we don't want any more victims of this emergency law. And you can see so many people on the streets just looking like this middle-class woman. So again, it's pretty much across the board, inclusive and grassroots. So basically, what we can see here is redefining the notion of activism and resistance. The emergence of bottom-up, horizontal, grassroots movements which engages the widest possible segments of women. This is a very important thing that we are witnessing here, denouncing government-manufactured activism and feminism, which results in what we can call tokenism or cosmetic feminism, right? The First Lady syndrome, people at the top, the rich, the elites. The birth of empowerment as an indigenous, autonomous effort on the part of women themselves to enact change with their own hands and to speak in their own voices. Very important. If you are not at the table, you will be on the menu. So it's a very important lesson here for women to participate and to be actually effectively engaged and actively involved. The birth of a parallel revolution which involves resistance in the socio-political domains simultaneously, which is why the title of the book is Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, because we do believe that you cannot divorce or separate one from the other. And let's not forget the legal struggle as well that we talked about before. The role of cyberfeminism is also something which the book talks about. The term cyberfeminism refers to a process whereby women deploy new forms of communication, mainly online tools of communication, to advocate for their own rights, causes, and demands, and to fight various forms of discrimination, injustice, or repression. It is considered the sister of the term cyber-activism, which is the use of online tools to advance a cause which is difficult to advance offline. So if you want to start a campaign to resist repression or autocracy or dictatorship, you can use cyberfeminism in this case to advocate for women's rights using new tools of social media and communication. Women hailed the role of new media in serving the needs of women and helping their causes in particular, as well as the role in defying power and authority in general, both politically and socially. And three main functions emerged here for the process of cyberfeminism. Most of the women that were interviewed or covered in these studies showed that they used cyberfeminism for three main functions: mobilization, documentation, and education. Mobilization is rallying support for certain causes which are important for women, collecting the needed funds, securing the needed resources to help others. For example, helping Syrian women who became refugees or rape victims. Some campaigns and groups started to form in the diaspora to gather the needed material and psychological help for them. Documentation, using their cameras and cell phones to show the whole world incidents of brutality, humiliation, and harassment against women. So some young activists will say, I will go out and protest. And if somebody tries to harass me or to attack me, I'm going to use my cell phone as my weapon, right? My cell phone is going to be my weapon. I'm going to use it to document this moment of harassment. And guess what? In a few minutes, it's going to go viral, and the whole world is going to see it. Education, raising awareness about women's issues and discussing them through what they described as positive media efforts. In other words, trying to educate people about women's issues and raise awareness about women's issues and women's concerns became also another third function for cyberfeminism. However, just like everything else in the world, this phenomena of cyberfeminism has its own limitations, because indeed we have to know that there are limitations of social media. While they may aid socio-political change as catalysts, they may speed up the process, they can amplify voices. At the same time, they are not magical tools, and they cannot bring about change all by themselves. It's always the people, and in this case women themselves, who can create actual change in the real world if and when they decide to do so. So it is wise to adopt an approach of cyber realism, which avoids the two undesirable bipolar extremes of cyber pessimism and cyber optimism. In other words, you can have cyber optimism like, oh yeah, fantastic, the Facebook revolution in Egypt, the Twitter uprising in Tunisia. No, these are just tools, right? It is what we make out of them that really matters. Or cyber pessimism, like this is not important. Why are you even studying this phenomena? It doesn't matter. We want to reach the middle ground of cyber realism, put it in the right middle ground. You can look at the potentials and the strengths, but also be aware of the limitations and weaknesses, because they cannot bring about change and reform and democracy all by themselves. It's us, the people, in this case the women, who can actually make it happen. So there have been some gains and opportunities for Arab women. Arab women today have a lot of opportunities to fight for their causes, spread their messages, and make their voices heard in some unprecedented ways. Social media are providing Arab women today with the needed window to see the rest of the world and to be seen by the rest of the world simultaneously, as well as the needed tools to network, organize, and mobilize. The affordability, accessibility, interactivity, and immediacy of these tools made them especially important in enacting socio-political change and socio-political transformation. So these are important gains and opportunities that have been made available for Arab women. The rise of new young Arab women activists who are combining online and offline activism to fight for their political, social, and legal rights. To actually, it's very important, is particularly important and useful for women, as it increased the salience and the visibility of women's issues and helped to secure support for them. Many of these young women activists became public opinion leaders who are setting good role models and good examples and positive examples, not just for other women, but for all citizens, men and women alike, to follow and to emulate. And one good example is the young woman that myself and Nada Al-Wadi talk about in our chapter in the book, Ayat El-Gumaizi, a 20-year-old young activist who stood up in the middle of Pearl Square in Manama, the capital of Bahrain, and she had the courage to criticize the king and the royal family, which is like unheard of, and to say a very, very strong poem, and to say, you have stolen things from us. Wow. She was arrested, she was jailed, and she was then forced to give some kind of fake apology on TV. And some of the men said, wait a minute, I wish I had half of this woman's courage. I wish I can be half as brave as this woman. So they became iconic role models and positive examples, not just for women, but for men as well. The increase in youth activism is especially important and relevant when it comes to supporting women's issues, since both youth and women were actually perceived to be two sides of the same coin of activism. And many of the women activists themselves were very young women in their 20s, 30s, under 40 years of age. Youth are the fastest growing segment of the population as well in the Arab world. About 70% of the population in the Arab world are young people, and they are, of course, agents of change because they are technologically savvy, they are risk takers, they have the energy, the creativity, determination. So when you see this combination of being a woman and being a young woman, we see also potential for the future for these people to change the realities of their own countries and to step up as leaders and activists in their own right. However, just like everything else in life, although we have all of these great opportunities and achievements, we also have some threats and challenges. The reversals in freedom in post-Arab Spring countries, I would say with the exception of Tunisia, unfortunately the outcome in many of the so-called Arab Spring countries has not been particularly very rosy or flowery. We know that has not been the case, unfortunately. And these reversals in freedom, like we said before, is also likely to have negative effects and implications on women's activism and participation. The shift from solidarity to fragmentation and polarization. People are not united anymore in this moment of solidarity and unity. Now you have fragmentation and you have polarization. Creating an unsafe public space for women through sexual harassment, things like violence, rape, virginity testing, which happened in Egypt, unfortunately. All of these things create an unsafe public space which aims to intimidate and scare women so they don't actually step up and take part in activism. The rise of political Islam in some of the countries has been perceived from the liberal secular camp as a threat to women's rights because some of these groups might have too conservative agendas, or the agenda may not be as inclusive or open to women's participation as they hoped for. The reactionary patriarchal culture, the misogyny, patriarchy, and stagnant traditions in these countries as well. Educational, economic, and infrastructural constraints. The overshadowing and marginalization of women's roles and contributions despite their numerous sacrifices. So after the uprising, they're told, thank you ladies, you can now go back to the kitchen, like we said before. All of these things pose certain threats and challenges for Arab women's activism moving forward. There are also uncertainties, things that we don't have an answer for and we are uncertain about. The future of Arab women's movements and the gains they actually can secure moving forward are very much related to the future of their own respective countries, many of which are now in flux or even in limbo and chaos without any clear roadmap at the present time. This is applicable in countries where the struggle for freedom resulted in a tragic civil war, like the case of Syria, sectarian violence and internal fighting like Libya and Yemen, a reversal in freedom and recycling of the old regime like Egypt, or an invisible forgotten uprising like Bahrain, with the only exception so far being Tunisia, which secured reasonable political and social gains for some of the reasons we mentioned before, being a smaller country, women's education is high, education in general is better, and so on. But in most of these countries there have been uncertainties and really difficulties moving forward. So, finally, what are some of the most important reflections and findings? What can we really come up with at the end of the day, based on everything that the book has discussed or looked at? The parallel struggles in which Arab women have been taking part, whether in the political, social, or legal spheres over many decades, developed and evolved over several stages, extending before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprisings. That's one important finding. These struggles are closely intertwined with the complex realities witnessed in different Arab countries, and they could be said to be both mirrors and molders, causes and effects of these struggles. They're closely intertwined with them. We cannot divorce one from the other, since they are both contributing to them as well as being shaped by them simultaneously in an ongoing cyclical process. So in other words, these movements are reflections of the countries, and at the same time they are being shaped and affected by the realities in these countries in an ongoing cyclical process. The importance and significance of women's active participation and involvement in decision-making processes, as well as drafting new laws and regulations in their respective countries, coming up with new laws, makes a huge difference and leads to significant gains, as we have seen in the case of Tunisia. The significance of coalition building and bridging the differences between different groups of women representing different ideological orientations and backgrounds. Again, as we have seen in the case of Tunisia, the success of bottom-up grassroots activism, which is much more effective than top-down elitist form of tokenism or feminism, acknowledging the contributions, at the same time the limitations of the phenomena of cyber-feminism. It has both its pros and cons, limitations and weaknesses, as well as contributions, and we have to acknowledge both of them. And it's useful to bear in mind that the developments witnessed in the realm of Arab women's activisms and resistances cross-cuts a number of diametrically opposed binaries, and oftentimes evolves and develops at the intersection between them. These include, but are not limited to, the following: hegemony versus resistance, religiosity versus secularization, globalization versus localization, the private sphere versus the public sphere, and the online versus the offline. So you see these diametrically opposed phenomena. We can say that women's activism and Arab women's activism emerges at the crossroads or the intersections between these different binaries. And finally, a final word. In looking ahead, it would be wise to adopt a realistic, balanced approach in predicting the future of women's movements and their varied forms of activism and resistance in the context of ongoing socio-political transformations in this volatile region, which acknowledges their gains and contributions, but also takes into account the challenges and limitations and the threats which are confronting them simultaneously. So we want to see what has been done and accomplished, which is awesome, but we also have to be aware of the challenges and limitations. In doing so, we can be gratified by what has been accomplished so far, but we also should be humbled by what remains to be achieved. Thank you so much, and ready for your questions.
Is this working? Yes. Thanks very much for some really interesting talk. The liberal law that was passed in Tunisia, as we often find in history, I'm a historian, we often pass laws, but society doesn't adjust immediately to those laws. So how ready was Tunisian society to accept this, and how much effect has it had in Tunisia? How much resistance has there been to it?
Thank you so much for the question. Indeed, we talked about laws being important, right? And it's important to draft new laws and change bad laws, and this is important, but it's not enough. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient, because I think your question also touches upon a very important point, which is how ready is society itself to accept these changes. And indeed, in the case of the new Tunisian law that we talked about, there has been also some kind of resistance to it. There has been even some objection to it. Some people said, maybe the society is not ready for it now. If you ask for complete parity or equality in every realm of life, maybe that is not always even helpful to women themselves, because a woman can get, a dowry that a man does not get, or she can get some kind of, support in the case of divorce that a man does not get. And if you say complete parity and equality, then you're actually going to take away some rights from women. And therefore, they were thinking of something like a law that talks about complementarity, but not equality. So some voices in Tunisia started to say, okay, complementarity, but not equality. Maybe men and women are not equal in everything, but hey, they can complement one another. And it was very interesting to see a huge number of people across the board, including men and women, and we said before we should not exclude men from the conversation or the activism and so on. Both men and women, they swept the streets of Tunisia in big numbers saying, we are equal, not just complementary. Women are equal, they're not just complementary. So there's been this back and forth, tug of war, if you will, push and pull mechanism in terms of what is considered acceptable and what is considered unacceptable, right? And of course you had all of these different forces. But what I really like in the case of Tunisia in particular, and I think it's a good model to be emulated in the rest of the Arab world and in the world in general in terms of women's movements, is this ability at the end of the day to build successful alliances and successful coalitions across the board. So for us to work together does not mean we have to be identical or of the same mindset. We can come from different perspectives. But hey, here is the challenge. Can we actually bridge some of these differences in order to build some kind of successful alliance or some kind of successful movement? In many countries, women's movements did not succeed because they were not able to create these alliances and create these kinds of bridges. In the case of Tunisia, we saw different groups like civil society groups and activists. Actually, they won the Nobel Peace Prize for being able to create some kind of peaceful rotation of power and successful alliances and coalitions among themselves, which has not been emulated unfortunately in the rest of the Arab world. So this is what I see as the successful model in Tunisia in the ability to bridge the gaps. It does not mean that there was no objection or that there was no difference. There are objections and there are differences, but at the end of the day they were able to successfully work together and to bridge some of the gaps. And I think this is a lesson for any type of civic movement in general and women's movements in particular to learn from. Can you come up to?
were talking about how there was the the legal struggle, and you said many women weren't documented. Is this in many Arab countries or only a few, and is it not documented in general or just in terms of work?
Right, this is also an important question because actually in many parts of the Arab world, and I think in many parts of developing countries, or I don't like to use the term third world, but in developing countries or developing nations, that is a problem, that many of these women's labor is not really documented, officially speaking. And there's also this kind of societal mindset, like, unless you get this paycheck, like I said, every 2 weeks or at the end of the month, you're not really working. And that's why things like child care and looking after your kids, this is important work. It supports society in so many ways. If we don't value this kind of work, if we don't really consider it quote unquote work, right? Being a homemaker, being a child carer, being a spouse, being a parent, which by the way is a shared responsibility. Many countries unfortunately do not have laws that ask the father, who is also a partner in creating the family, because the mother did not have the children all by herself. He is not really asked to step up and to play his role as a father. When I traveled to Switzerland for a conference, the first thing I saw when I came off the plane was a big sign that showed a father who is buried in documents and books in his office. And it had a very big banner that said, "Are you a good father?" I was like, wow, this is an important question to ask. Because women always get asked the question, are you a good mother? Did you cook breakfast? Did you take care of your children? Did you take them to school? Did you make sure that they have the next doctor's appointment? Well, yeah, but you have a partner, right? This partner, this father should also step up. So in some countries, especially in the Scandinavian countries, right? Now they have excellent laws when it comes to things like parental leave, paternity leave for men, right? And actually requiring men to take 2 to 3 months, okay? It doesn't matter if you are the CEO, a university president, you're a janitor, it doesn't matter what your position is, you will take these 2 to 3 month paternity leave. So you have all of these fathers, with the strollers and the pushchairs, they're taking the kids to the park and they're meeting other fathers and they're talking about their parenthood and being fathers, which I think is amazing. And I think this is again a model that needs to be followed elsewhere. So I think going back to your question, the problem is really multifold. Part of it is economic, part of it is social, part of it is legislations and laws. All of these things have to be taken into account if we are to change our mindset and our outlook on things like being a parent, women's roles, men's roles, participation in society, equity. All of these things we really need to, I think, redefine these notions, and we still have a long way to go. Even in this country, still women have to struggle to get maternity leave. Paternity leave for men, unheard of. Equal pay for women, we still have to struggle for it. We're still talking about so many issues and debating about them when they should be a given, right? We're talking about some of the most advanced countries, let alone the countries that have all of these economic, social challenges. So I think we still have a long way to go in terms of what should and can be achieved in all of these areas.
So what do you think is the future of the women activism now in Egypt, Syria? Excuse me. As you said, it was like kind of short-lived, and for me it's kind of going backward. So the only kind of like successful model is in Tunisia. So what do you think the future of the movements or the activism of women in these countries?
Thank you so much, Nabila. Nabila Hijazi, by the way, is a colleague here from the English writing program in Maryland, and she's originally from Syria. So her question about Syria is very important. And by the way, sometimes I attend panels and conferences talking about Syrian women. And then I see the whole panel does not have a single woman from Syria. Not a single Syrian woman. I go like, what's going on here? I'm sure if you try harder, you will be able to find at least one scholar from the particular country or region that you're trying to talk about. I am all for Western scholars writing about issues in the region, and that's why in this book we do have examples of non-Arab scholars, fantastic scholars contributing. But you must have also indigenous voices from within the region itself. This is also very, very important. So thank you for your participation and being here. This is a $1 million question. If I had the answer for it, I guess I'll be on CNN and and Forbes, and I'll be like a millionaire. I don't have an answer for it because, like I said at the very end of the presentation, that there's so much going on in the region right now. A lot of these countries are pretty much in transformation, but sometimes it's not a very smooth transformation. In some of the examples I mentioned, there are upheavals, but you don't really see a very clear path moving forward. The case of Syria, of course, is heartbreaking because of the civil war that has been going on for the last 7 years. I'm not particularly happy about the way things have progressed or developed in my own native country, Egypt. We were hoping for more democracy and more freedom by now and more reform rather than recycling of an old regime in even a more repressive way. As I said, there has been violence and sectarianism and struggles and fighting in many countries in the region like Libya and Yemen. Bahrain has had an uprising that people don't even know about or talk about. That's why I said it's the forgotten, quote-unquote, invisible uprising or revolution. I talk about it in my Arab media course, which I teach here at the University of Maryland, and many of my students have not even heard of Bahrain before. So I have to tell them, it's this small, country in the Gulf area, they had an uprising, and they're like listening, like, oh, we do not know about it, because it's not really in the news. But with all of that going on now, really when you think about it, we have a very big issue. It's called the chicken and egg question. What is the chicken and egg question here? Okay, to really kind of move forward on an agenda of reform and democratization, obviously, like we said, social media alone cannot do the trick. They're just tools, but they're not magical tools, and they cannot bring about change or transformation all by themselves. You need to have an active civic society. Civic society movements, opposition movements at the grassroots level, right? But at the same time, here's the chicken and egg question. But in order to have these movements, you also need to have some degree of democracy, right? So it's really like, in a way, you are puzzled by this chicken and egg question. To have democracy, you need an active civil society, but to have an active civil society, you need a degree of democracy. Because if I was going to create a party, or an NGO, or a movement tomorrow morning, but I know that I'm going to be arrested the next day, if not the same day, I'm not going to create it. Let's face it, right? So there is a very high risk. So again, all of these obstacles and all of these layers of challenges make it extremely hard for us to predict what kind of path, what kind of course of action is going to take place. And of course, all of that is, as I said, mirrors and molders, causes and effects of Arab women's activism as well. At the time when you had more freedom, more democracy, people were able to express their views, many of these movements flourished, and people were more active and women were more involved, and vice versa. When you see a repression, a backlash in freedom, in democracy, this also definitely affects the degree of women's involvement and activism at the same time. So I mean, this is $1 million question, like I said. I do not really have an answer for it, but I can just say that we can learn some lessons, definitely, from the successful model or example of Tunisia in terms of the importance of education in general, the importance of women's education in particular, because Tunisia has a very high level of literacy compared to other Arab countries, over 90% level of literacy, and women's education is also very high. Women's involvement in things like legislation, being judges, drafting laws, very important. Women's ability to bridge the differences and build coalition movements across the board, very important. So all of these lessons, I think, in my opinion, we can learn them from the Tunisian model. As much as some of my Tunisian friends, they're not particularly happy about it. No, we still have a long way to go. I'm like, yeah, but look at the other countries in the region. You should also feel gratified by what you have achieved. And yes, you do have a long way to go, but at least you are not having some of the really heartbreaking outcomes that we have witnessed in other countries in the region. So I think that there are lessons to be learned, but there are definitely so many unanswered questions and difficulties in terms of predicting the future path because of all of the reasons we mentioned. So if you find an answer to this question, share it with me. We will all make it on CNN.
Thank you very much. I was really interested in the dynamics between sort of the movements that are country-based versus like kind of the region-based. And I was curious if you're seeing like a fabric emerge across the region of this like young generation. I'm just curious like how that conversation is going on across these different movements.
Absolutely, beautiful question, thank you. The activism in the diaspora is very important. Indeed, when the Arab Spring movement started, right, they started in Tunisia, moved on to Egypt, and then Libya, and so on. A lot of the young activists were actually engaging in some kind back and forth dialogue and exchange of knowledge and information across the borders and across their different countries, right? So for example, you will find some activists in Tunisia giving advice and giving recommendations to some of the young activists in Egypt, right? If you go to Tahrir Square, make sure you don't have your ID on you, right? And make sure you have enough water. If you are a woman, and this is the weirdest advice I ever heard, and you're wearing a scarf, put an onion and vinegar under your scarf. Does not appeal to me very much, the idea of onion and vinegar under my scarf, to overcome the effect of tear gas. Okay, that's supposed to kind of help you to overcome the tear gas, right? So things like that, you can spray, black paint at the police vehicles in order to, kind of obstruct them, so they cannot really come after you and arrest you. So these types of very specific pieces of advice have been circulating back and forth between the young activists across the board and across the borders of different countries in the region, interestingly enough. So yes, there has been definitely evidence of cooperation and collaboration and exchange of useful knowledge and advice and information between different countries. And the same could be said as well between different movements that have been advocating for women's rights and so on. There has been some back and forth discussions and exchange of knowledge and information. But I think that more has to be done as well. Like, we're not always aware of everything that's happening in other parts of the region. And I think that the fact that the new law, for example, in Tunisia, started to snowball and it started to have some useful echoes in other countries, like Lebanon, like Jordan. They started to also get rid of the law of shame that we talked about. They started to emulate the successful model of Tunisia. If anything, this shows us the importance of trying to learn from each other's experiences and open channels of collaboration. But I think the importance of studying the activists in the diaspora, studying those outside of the region and their effect on the movements in their own home countries is very important. In the case of Syria in particular, for example, the activists in the diaspora have been doing a lot in terms of raising awareness about certain issues, trying to recruit, trying to mobilize, trying to provide material resources and help for victims of the Syrian civil war, especially in the case of women, helping rape victims, women who lost their male spouses and providers, all of that. So a lot of activity has been going on in the diaspora and affecting activism back home, and I think that's an area of research that needs more attention and more academic writing moving forward. Other questions?
I had another question.
Sure.
And you kind of mentioned the benefits that activists have seen from new communication tools. I think you mentioned like mobilization, documenting brutality, harassment, and then education. I was wondering if there's anything you could speak to about the cost, potentially the cost of being very visible on like these new media platforms, if any.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, just like we talked about, everything has pros and cons, right? Strengths and weaknesses, benefits and limitations. It's not only the activists who are building the learning curves. The regimes in power are also building the learning curves, meaning they're also learning their lessons. And they're now able to be more technologically savvy and more involved and more active online. What does that mean? It does not just mean that they're creating their own Facebook pages and blogs, which they are doing, but they're also becoming more clever in terms of chasing and tracing some of the activists online, hijacking some of their activities, blocking some of their activities, and even in some tragic cases, actually getting hold of these activists, arresting them, putting them behind bars, or even killing them. There is this famous case of the Libyan activist who is actually using his own computer, his own laptop computer, as his own broadcasting station to the rest of the world to spread news about what was happening in Libya in the struggle against Gaddafi. The Gaddafi men were able to trace him through his own IP address, find out where he is, and actually storm his apartment and unfortunately kill him as he was actually doing his live broadcasting online. So his wife came in and she said, "This is a very sad moment for me. I have to report to you that my husband has unfortunately been killed right now." And that's a very, clear example of how there can be a very high cost and a very high price for some of these people who engage in activism online, because it can be a double-edged sword. Yes, it can help you to be active and visible, but this visibility in itself, like you said, can have a cost and a price as well. And part of this cost and price is you're now visible, people know who you are, and therefore it's easy for you to be identified, and it's easy for the government to come after you. Which is why some of the activists, including women activists, have been using things like, just anonymous identities on the internet, or using nicknames or pseudonyms in order to try to get around this particular point. And I interviewed this 20-year-old activist from Libya, and she was really very cool. She said, my family said to me, if you really want to blog and do all of that stuff that you're doing on the internet, the only way we can allow you to do it is if you are anonymous. We are not ready for you to be killed or to be harassed or raped or arrested or whatever, and we don't want the family name out there. So there is political and social constraints here, right? The political is we don't want you to get arrested, and the social is we don't want the family name out there. So she had to blog and to do all of her online activism anonymously. And then she said to me with sadness in her eyes, but if I do all of that anonymously, how can CNN find out about me? They will never find out about me. I can never be on BBC. I can never be on CNN because nobody knows who I am, right? And she said it in a very genuine and profound way, and I was so proud of her, right? And at the same time, I can see where she's coming from, because she deserves to be recognized for her own activism. But like you said, there is a price, a very high price, which also comes along with it. So these are real threats that we have to think about, and think about how the internet can be this double-edged sword in many cases.
And thank you so much for your talk, Sahar. It was very fascinating. So, talking about following up on what you just said, can you share any personal experiences, since you're a researcher and a scholar, how this affected you here in the US and maybe in Egypt or in those countries?
Thank you so much. I'll just tell you that it's very hard to detach or separate who you are from what you write, right? So we are all subjective beings. I don't believe in 100% complete freedom, because this is a myth. There's always a margin that shrinks and stretches, and also there is no such thing as 100% complete objectivity. It also does not exist, because we are all subjective beings. Even choosing the topic of this book and what you write about in your own scholarship, and your decision to come here this afternoon and to honor me by being part of this discussion is a choice that you are making, and it shows to me that you have an interest in this topic. So you cannot separate one from the other. And indeed, being an Egyptian woman, academic, scholar, wearing all of these different hats or wearing all of these different scarves, in my case, has not been an easy thing. It has been very hard. And I remember very well when I heard that Mubarak stepped down. Oh my God, I can never ever forget this day. Literally, I was jumping up and down in joy, called my sister in Egypt, we're like, yes, the Egyptians made it, we're making history, there is no going back. And I was asked to give a talk at the Middle East program in the Wilson Center here in DC. And I was like very vibrant, and and I was of course 7 years younger as well. And I was like very dynamic and like, yeah, Egyptian women, Arab women, we made it. This is historical. And when I finished, the moderator said, okay, thank you so much, Dr. Khamis, but don't you think you're a little bit upbeat? I was like, no, we made it. This is historical. And like 7 years later, I'm like, maybe I was a little bit upbeat. You know what I'm saying? Like now I'm even thinking of revisiting my own scholarship and my own writing and some of the stuff that I have written on the Arab Spring movements and the revolutions and women's role, all of that stuff. Yes, a lot has been done, a lot has been accomplished, this is awesome, they used Facebook, they blogged. But at the end of the day, right, did that actually translate into the desired socio-political transformation and transition that was hoped for? No. So that means that we have a lot of blind spots. We have to really try to fill some of these gaps and answer some of these questions as academics, as scholars, as activists, right? Studying and restudying and readdressing and revisiting this whole notion or notions of activisms and resistances and women's multiple roles and engagement by really saying, okay, this is awesome. But what did we miss? What did we really not pay enough attention to? What is it that I should have paid attention to 7 years ago in my scholarship that I did not really account for? So I have an article in the International Journal of Communication, which is called The Transformative Egyptian Media Landscape, okay? So I talk about the transitions and transformations in Egyptian media historically up to the point of the 2011 revolution. And you can sense some of this euphoria and optimism in my writing. 7 years later, right? You're 7 years wiser, or I don't know, older, whatever, whichever way you want to look at it. And you go back and say, okay, now let me go back and rewrite this piece, which is something I'm thinking about doing, and say, okay, now we have some reversals in democratization. What went wrong? What are some of the gaps? What are some of the blind spots? What are some of the things that we should have paid attention to and we did not really sufficiently pay attention to 7 years ago? So I think that what really inspires me to do this kind of work and to continue doing it is this, multiplicity of multifolded and multifaceted identity. Being a woman, being an Egyptian, American, a scholar, academic, writer, media person, all of these multiple identities that intersect within me inspire me to go ahead and to continue to do the work, but to do it, I think, with a less euphoric attitude and a much more realistic perspective of really looking at the gaps and what we need to do to fill them moving forward.
Well, I think you can still look at the gaps, but still be very upbeat about it. Hopefully. Okay, I think that's it. Anybody have one last question? So we could thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you.